In a peaceful and thriving village, there lived two families who shared a bond so deep that many in the community often mistook them for blood relatives. Their connection was rare, stronger than mere friendship, closer than simple neighborly ties. They laughed together, celebrated together, and even wept in times of sorrow as if they were one. The first family, led by Mr. Clifford and his wife, Margaret, lived in luxury. Mr. Clifford was a highly respected bank manager, a man of influence whose words carried weight in the village. His wife, Margaret, was no less successful. She owned one of the largest supermarkets in the city, a place where many villagers shopped for quality goods. Their wealth was evident in everything they did: the grand mansion they lived in, the luxurious cars they drove, and the way their 3 children were dressed in the finest clothes money could buy. On the other hand, the second family, led by Mr. Ben and his wife, Lydia, lived a simple, modest life. Mr. Ben was a dedicated schoolteacher, a man passionate about education, though his salary barely provided enough for his family. His wife, Lydia, was a hard-working trader, selling food items in the small village market. Their income was just enough to get by, but despite their struggles, they were content. They had 6 children, making them a family of 8, and though they didn't have much, their household was filled with love, respect, and strong moral values. Despite the financial gap between them, the children of both families played together as if wealth and status did not exist. They ran through the village streets, laughing and chasing one another. They sat under the big mango tree in the evenings, telling stories and sharing their little snacks. Their innocence and genuine love for one another were pure, untouched by the differences in their parents' financial status. However, beneath this seemingly perfect harmony, a silent contrast grew stronger with time. Mr. Ben, though not a wealthy man, raised his children with discipline, humility, and respect. His children, despite their struggles, never felt entitled to anything beyond their reach. They were well-mannered, respectful to elders, and deeply rooted in the values their father had instilled in them. If they visited Mr. Clifford's home and were offered gifts or expensive food, they never grabbed or fought over it. Instead, they thanked their hosts politely, sometimes even declining out of humility. But the same could not be said for Mr. Clifford's children. With wealth came a certain level of pride and arrogance. His 3 children were given everything they ever wanted on a silver platter: expensive toys, fine clothing, and the best education money could buy. They never knew what it meant to lack or struggle, and as a result, they grew up with a sense of entitlement. Where Mr. Ben's children would say, "Thank you," and "Please," Mr. Clifford's children would demand more, expecting things to be handed to them simply because they were accustomed to it. Yet, despite these differences, both families remained close. However, the winds of fate had a way of shifting, and soon, a storm was about to brew, one that would shake the foundation of their long-standing friendship. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky burned orange with the last light of day, an event occurred that no one could have foreseen. Years passed, and the children of Mr. Ben grew into responsible young adults. Despite their humble upbringing, they excelled in their studies, carrying the values of hard work, honesty, and discipline that their parents had instilled in them. However, as they reached the stage where they were ready to further their education, reality struck hard. University education was expensive, and Mr. Ben's modest salary as a teacher, coupled with Lydia's small market business, was simply not enough to cover the costs. Their eldest son, Kachi, was the first to complete his secondary education with outstanding results. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, a dream that had burned in his heart since childhood. But without money, that dream seemed like a distant star, something he could see but never touch. Desperate to support their children's education, Mr. Ben and Lydia turned to the one family they trusted the most, the Cliffords. One evening, after much contemplation, Mr. Ben gathered the courage to visit Mr. Clifford's grand mansion. His heart pounded as he knocked on the large wooden doors, hoping that his old friend would extend a helping hand in their time of need. "Ah, Ben, my good friend." Mr. Clifford greeted him with a warm smile as he opened the door. Come in, come in." Inside, the house smelled of expensive perfume and freshly cooked meals. The furniture gleamed under the golden chandelier lights, and the air conditioning made the atmosphere cool and comfortable, a stark contrast to Mr. Ben's own small, warm house where a single standing fan struggled to keep the air moving. Mr. Clifford led him to the plush leather couch, where Lydia soon joined them, looking hopeful but nervous. After exchanging pleasantries, Mr. Ben cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Clifford, I won't waste your time. My son, Kochi, has worked so hard, and he has been offered admission into the university. But," he hesitated, then took a deep breath. "We don't have enough money to pay for his tuition. I was hoping you could help us with a loan. Just something to get him started. I promise to repay you gradually." Mr. Clifford exchanged a glance with his wife, Margaret, who let out a small sigh. She shifted in her seat, as if uncomfortable with the request. Ben," Mr. Clifford finally said, shaking his head regretfully. "I really wish I could help, but things have been tight for us as well. You know, the economy is bad, and we have a lot of responsibilities." Margaret quickly nodded in agreement. "Yes, my dear, it's been tough for us. Even my supermarket isn't making as much profit as before." Mr. Ben's heart sank. He knew this wasn't true. The Cliffords were still as wealthy as ever. He had seen Margaret's supermarket expanding, and Mr. Clifford had recently bought a brand new car. Yet, they claimed they had no money to spare. Swallowing his disappointment, Mr. Ben forced a smile. "I understand," he said. "Thank you anyway." Despite the rejection, the relationship between the two families remained cordial. Mr. Ben held no grudge, and his family continued to live in peace with the Cliffords. But life was getting harder. Determined not to give up on his dreams, Kochi took matters into his own hands. He started doing menial jobs around the community, carrying blocks at construction sites, cleaning gutters, and working as a laborer wherever he could find work. He would wake up before sunrise and return home exhausted, his hands blistered, his clothes soaked in sweat. Each morning, as Mr. Clifford and his wife drove past the construction site on their way to work, they would see Kochi bent over, lifting heavy cement bags or mixing concrete. They would slow down slightly, shake their heads, and whisper to each other. "Look at him," Margaret would say, "carrying blocks like a common laborer. If only Ben had managed his life better." Mr. Clifford would sigh, gripping the steering wheel. "I wonder why he doesn't just accept that not everyone is meant for university. Maybe he should just learn a trade." They never stopped to offer help. They never rolled down their tinted windows to ask if he needed anything. Instead, they would drive off, leaving a cloud of dust behind as Kochi continued to struggle under the hot sun. And then, things took a turn for the worse. One afternoon, Lydia collapsed in the middle of the market. Traders rushed to her side, fanning her, splashing water on her face, but she remained weak and unresponsive. She was quickly rushed to the village hospital, where she was admitted in critical condition. Mr. Ben was frantic. He stayed by her side day and night, praying, hoping for good news. After a series of tests, the doctor finally called him into his office. His face was grave, and his voice was heavy. "Mr. Ben," the doctor began, choosing his words carefully, "your wife's condition is serious. She has been diagnosed with breast cancer, and it is spreading rapidly. If we don't act fast, it could move to the second breast, and from there, it will become even harder to control." Mr. Ben's knees weakened. His head spun as if the walls of the office were closing in on him. "But, what can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor leaned forward. "She needs urgent surgery. And to be honest, our hospital does not have the advanced equipment required for such an operation. The best option is to fly her to London for treatment before it's too late." London. Mr. Ben's voice cracked. He could barely afford to feed his family, let alone pay for an operation overseas. "Yes," the doctor continued. "The earlier, the better. If we delay, the cancer will spread further, and then even surgery might not save her." Tears welled in Mr. Ben's eyes. He clenched his fists, feeling helpless. His beloved wife, the mother of his 6 children, was fighting for her life, and he had no means to save her. How was he supposed to raise such an enormous amount of money? As he walked out of the hospital, his heart burdened with worry, one thought crossed his mind. Would the Cliffords help this time? Would they turn him away again? Or would this be the moment they finally proved that their friendship was deeper than just words? The entire Ben family was drowning in despair. The weight of Lydia's illness pressed heavily on their shoulders, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find the money they needed. Day after day, Mr. Ben moved from one place to another, pleading with friends, relatives, and even strangers, but no one was willing or able to offer any significant help. Some sympathized but had little to give, while others simply avoided him. Kochi, watching his mother grow weaker by the day, couldn't take it anymore. One evening, he approached his father with a determined look on his face. "Papa, let's go back to Mr. Clifford," he said. "Let's try again. Maybe this time he'll help us." Mr. Ben's expression hardened. "No, Kochi. That man is wicked. The last time I went to him, he turned us away without any compassion. I will not beg him again." "But Papa," Kochi pleaded, "this is different. Mama's life is at stake. Even if he is wicked, we have no choice. We have to try again." Mr. Ben sighed heavily. Every part of him resisted the idea of returning to Mr. Clifford, but what choice did he have? His wife's condition was getting worse. If swallowing his pride was the price to pay for her survival, then so be it. With no other options left, he agreed. That evening, he and Kochi made their way to Mr. Clifford's house. As they approached the grand mansion, their hearts pounded with hope and fear. Unbeknownst to them, Mr. Clifford and his wife, Margaret, had already seen them from the upstairs window. Margaret clicked her tongue in irritation. "Look at them again. I knew they would come back." Mr. Clifford sighed. "I don't want to deal with them. I'm tired of their begging." "What do we do?" Margaret asked. He thought for a moment before turning to one of the maids. "Go downstairs and tell them we are sleeping." The maid hesitated. Even she felt uncomfortable lying, but she dared not disobey. She went to the front door, opened it slightly, and spoke through the small gap. "Ah, Mr. Ben, good evening," she said hesitantly. "I'm sorry, but Master and Madam are already asleep." Mr. Ben's heart sank. He had seen their shadows pass by the window moments ago. He knew they were lying. "Please, my daughter," he pleaded. "Tell them it's urgent. My wife's life is in danger." The maid lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing I can do." Kochi clenched his fists in frustration, but Mr. Ben held his son's arm, signaling him to remain calm. Without another word, they turned and walked away. But they were not giving up yet. That night, long after the stars had filled the sky, Mr. Ben and Kochi returned. This time, they were determined to see Mr. Clifford face to face. They knocked. There was no response. They knocked again, harder this time. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally opened, and Mr. Clifford himself stood before them. His expression was unreadable, but his arms were crossed over his chest, a clear sign that he was not pleased with their late-night visit. Margaret stood behind him, her face cold and emotionless. Without hesitation, Mr. Ben and Kochi fell to their knees. "Please, Clifford," Mr. Ben begged, his voice breaking. "I know I have come to you before, but I have nowhere else to go. My wife, Lydia, she is dying. The doctor says we need to fly her to London immediately, or we will lose her. Please, if there is anything you can do, help us." Tears streamed down his face as he spoke. He had never felt so helpless, so desperate. Kochi, who had always been strong and composed, could no longer hold back his emotions. His voice cracked as he joined his father in pleading. "Uncle Clifford, please," he sobbed. "If you won't do it for my father, do it for my mother. She has always treated you with respect. She has always welcomed your family with open arms. Please, help us save her life." The intensity of their pleading filled the air with raw emotion. The Clifford children, who had been watching silently from the staircase, were moved to tears. For the first time, they saw something they had never witnessed before. Genuine pain, real suffering. One of them, their youngest daughter, whispered, "Papa, please help them." Mr. Clifford remained silent for a long time. His eyes flickered with hesitation, but his pride and selfishness were stronger. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed and finally spoke. "Come back next week," he said. "I will see what I can do." Mr. Ben and Kochi exchanged glances, a flicker of hope lighting their eyes. "Thank you," Mr. Ben said, his voice still trembling. "Thank you so much." But deep down, a question lingered. Was Mr. Clifford truly willing to help, or was this just another way to push them away? The answer would come soon enough. Stay tuned for the part 2 of this story. If you're just joining for the first time, kindly subscribe to this channel, like, comment and share these videos to as many as possible. See you in my next episode.